My name is Kimaren. I am an indigenous person from the pastoralist Maasai community based in Kenya. And I work with an indigenous people organization called Indigenous Livelihood Enhancement Partners, ILEPA. And I have been privileged to be one of the members of the Global Indigenous People Movement following climate change negotiations in a few COPs, including here in COP25 in Madrid.
Why is it so important, Kimaren, for indigenous representatives to be here in the COP?
It took us some time. It is critically important that indigenous peoples are directly engaging at the COP processes for a number of reasons. First, most of the interventions implemented by our countries comes as decisions made at these multilateral and international processes. The international mechanisms, for example, like the Convention on Climate Change, are political decision-making spaces. While they are far more removed from the ground, the implementation of the decisions is within our communities. And for many years, indigenous people have not had the opportunity or did not come to the realization that actually what their governments are implementing are decisions made thousands of miles away in spaces far removed from communities, like here in Madrid, Spain. And so when you look at, for example, the decisions around forests, which indigenous peoples are guardians of forests, the intervention called RED, which is basically how to keep standing forest standing, small payment, they are made here. But where are they rolled out? These interventions, though decisions made in Europe, in the most developed spaces away from where forests are implemented within our communities and our locales. Secondly, our governments are signatories to our parties, have committed themselves to this convention of climate change. And if we are not aware that, say for example, if a decision on safeguard is made, like the safeguards information systems on RED, again, so it's one thing knowing the intervention, but it's another understanding the modalities around safeguarding our rights and interests as communities. So RED, for example, which is a forest intervention approach or mechanism, has safeguards. But how many of our local communities, our indigenous communities, are familiar with the safeguards? In fact, the safeguards themselves would not have been there if indigenous peoples were not engaging in the UNFCCC decision. It was not a philanthropic decision by state parties to put safeguards because they love indigenous people. It was a fight by the few indigenous people who managed to be in these spaces. In Paris, in Paris, the Paris Agreement, again, now rights are there, indigenous knowledge are there, participation of indigenous people is there, the local communities and indigenous people to enable the sharing of this knowledge is there. These elements will not have been in the Paris Agreement if some of us and a number of indigenous people from the rest of the world were here to hold state to account, and they have been fighting, and I must, salute them. I salute the indigenous people, the few of us who have had the privilege really to engage on the behalf of our communities. So really, we cannot afford not to be in these spaces because this is where instruments of exclusion, instrument of displacement, instrument of violation of our rights are designed, and they are just imported and implemented on the ground. It is we urge our friends, our partners, our development partners, who have been kind enough to partner with the indigenous world to facilitate us being here, to keep doing the good job they are doing to bring us here. And kudos to them. Otherwise, our situation would have been worse if we were not present. We must keep engaging.
Next year we will see the revision of the nationally determined contributions of parties, the pledges, the NDCs. Why is this process important for indigenous peoples?
So, NDCs are very critical. Nationally determined contributions are very critical intervention measures for climate change that must be understood and shaped and engaged by indigenous people of the world. One of the decisions around mitigation that came out of the Paris Agreement was a national determined contribution. And in simple terms, national determined contribution are strategies by all countries, particularly of the South. So in fact, what the NDCs did, what the decision of the Paris Agreement did on the NDCs, to shift the burden and made sure that all countries commit to align their development agenda to a climate resilient future and targeted at reducing greenhouse gases emissions. And it is important because, in a nutshell, NDCs is about, for example, how do you shape, agriculture? How do you do food production, for example? Okay, so it's about climate smart agriculture, as they call it here. So it's about how do you manage land use and land use change? How do you address issues of sustainable food production, balancing it with climate change interests? It's about climate resilient infrastructure. It's about what they are calling now nature-based solutions. So every time you talk about nature and land, you talk about our lives. You talk about what we have kept for long. Research has shown that collectively held land by indigenous people stores the most carbon than these other privatized spaces. We have seen, for example, mechanisms like the clean development mechanism, which will also be now baptized to be sustainable development mechanism, will be part of these NDCs. So, which, for example, in the case of Kenya, where I come from, the so-called clean development mechanism has facilitated the displacement of indigenous communities from their land in the name of clean energy. So first, it is important to understand and engage with the NDCs because it's about our land. It's about our land and territories and resources. It is equally important because the first iteration, the first reports of NDCs that most countries submitted in 2015, we didn't have a chance to shape as indigenous people. It just bypassed us. It was not in our radar. This is a golden opportunity to do what we missed out in 2015, in the first reports, to actually make sure that these NDCs reflect our visions, respect our rights, create spaces for our engagement, and that any benefits associated to any interventions around nationally determined contributions are also find their way to us as indigenous community. So I really think it is a golden opportunity for indigenous people to shape their nationally determined contribution to, one, make sure that their rights are safeguarded, their indigenous knowledge is applied and respected, that their visions of adaptation and mitigations are reflected, and three, that if there is any benefits associated with the intervention, these benefits find their way in an equitable and fair share to indigenous communities.